Hello, and welcome back. So, for today, I have examined an article that has to do with training students in their working memory, as well as helping them with executive dysfunction, focused on students with ADHD. It is called Central Executive Training for ADHD Effects on Academic Achievement, Productivity, and Success in the Classroom. I am really excited about this one. All right, so overall, Central Executive Training, or CET, is a game-based system with 9 different simulations, and these all help train students on their working memory as well as their executive function, helping them to stay on task, maintain their goals for longer periods of time, over about 9 or 10 weeks of sessions. Essentially, in the training, students would meet with a researcher once a week, and then parents would uphold the training system for 2 to 3 days of at-home practice. Um, and teachers evaluated their students at the beginning as well as throughout, and at the end, parents evaluated their students as well as they evaluated academic achievement. Now, in addition to central executive training, the researchers had 2 other control groups running, one of which was receiving behavioral parent training, and the other which was receiving inhibitory control training. Now, these 2 programs are also computer-based trainings. The article did not give as much information on them, as well as this lovely visual, which is from the central executive training program. But they have variations that focus on different aspects of the students' capabilities. Central executive training focuses on academic achievement, whereas behavioral parent training focuses more on their behavior and like physical attentiveness, whereas inhibitory control training focuses on what students are trying to not do. Now, there were about 108 participants total between these 3 groups. They were split about equally between, and central executive training was shown to be better than the other 2 training programs for academic achievement, for behavior, as well as for executive function, as far as like staying on task and being able to stay attentive for longer periods of time and maintaining task goals. But BPT was shown to be generally effective, but ICT was not as effective. It had some good academic achievement results, but again, it was not as effective as CET. And one of the main thoughts of this article was this quote here: academic difficulties in ADHD are due in part to these children's underdeveloped executive functioning abilities. And essentially, these authors were trying to posit that, which will be a little bit on the author's perspective, that students with ADHD experienced more academic frustration and needed further support because they lacked executive function, being able to monitor themselves, stay on task, retain memory for long periods of time, and so forth. Moving on to author's perspective, we'll develop this just a little bit further. But that's essentially what their study focused on, was this computer-based program and how effective it was. Now, the authors were very adamant that schools have too large of a budget spent on special education. Not trying to say that special education should not have sufficient funds, it most certainly should, but that there were more effective ways of keeping students with ADHD inside of classrooms and not needing as much academic support. Instead, providing them with the support to develop their working memory, executive function, which would allow them to stay in those general ed settings and receive direct instruction successfully. And they believe that more attention should be spent helping students develop those abilities, because those will also carry over into their adult lives, not just educational settings. They also believe that specific learning disabilities, which we went over last week, should be considered in light of ADHD. A lot of the students that were a part of this study had another diagnosis or another concern, be it a special learning disability or depression or an emotional disturbance. And they considered those in light of the frustration that ADHD was causing them in terms of their school career as well as their success at home and with relationships. And they were focusing on how they could develop the brain to better succeed in that school setting and be able to focus for longer periods of time, to develop strategies to overcome what was missing in their brain functioning, in those neural networks, those neural pathways. And they posited early in the article that those neural pathways, if you could develop them to to work more effectively, that students would be able to succeed more on their own at school, and with less of someone staring over their shoulder. As for my opinion about this article, they placed a lot of importance on long-term effect and jumps in academic achievement. I feel like a lot of the reading and work that is done with ADHD focuses solely on the behavior and how teachers are frustrated that those students do not stay on task and do not listen and have trouble sitting still or have trouble being engaged or responding to questions, instead of saying their academic achievement is not sufficient to where it needs to be. Because at the end of the day, the school system's job is to provide everyone with a fair and equal education, not necessarily a fair and like not focusing like can they perform well in society or something like that. Like everyone has that right under the Constitution, but the educator's job is to focus on that academic achievement, which I also feel like is lacking a lot in the ADHD discussion. So I appreciated the authors focusing on like what are we doing to help them in their school career to succeed academically, as well as eventually adapt to adult life. What are the strategies that they can use? Another opinion that I have about this is that working memory impacts attention to tasks just as much as long-term learning. And by developing working memory, you're developing that person as a whole. You're helping their brain out with whatever is missing, instead of just saying, okay, well, what's something we can do to help us master this one math problem? What's a strategy we can use for that? Instead of saying that, focus on the working memory of why we couldn't remember the process that everybody else learned. Why are we having to focus on a different strategy to solve this math problem? Instead of why couldn't we learn the math problem at first? I mean, the math strategy at first, just as an example. Like I think to my students who are working right now, I have students that are working on fractions and everybody's using diagrams and manipulatives and stuff like that, which is something that's very new to me. And I'm noticing that there are certain students that have difficulty just remembering the process. And if we repeat the same process multiple times, eventually they'll retain it. It takes a very, very long time though. And I think about how they are much further behind than their classmates, maybe not because they aren't good at math or because they have a specific learning disability, but perhaps instead because they have difficulty remembering, they have difficulty applying what they have heard, what they have learned on their own. And so the trouble would not be what is the difficulty in math specifically, but what is the difficulty with the memory? What is the difficulty with the functioning? So I appreciated their focus on that instead of how can we help students with ADHD who struggle with math, but how can we help students with ADHD who struggle academically overall? What's our best training method for that whole student? Lastly, students who can be attentive in class can benefit from whole group direct instruction. If they can focus, then not if they can focus, but if they have this kind of training beforehand, then they can succeed in the general ed classroom setting. And we should still keep that goal of the least restrictive environment in mind instead of saying, oh, this student needs to be kept out because they're so far behind in math. Well, maybe they are, but if they could get back into that classroom setting with the strategies and the executive functioning needed to succeed, that should be our goal instead of saying, oh, we need to keep them out because they are not performing up to grade level. As for implications to practice, I think it would be good to determine a student's working memory at the beginning of the year. I think of some of my students who I had assumed that they didn't succeed because they didn't do their homework, and only now I'm saying, oh, I should assign homework that they can actually do because they're that far behind in our grade level standards. But instead, thinking at the beginning of the year, which one of them will probably not even remember what we did in class at the end of the day? All in all, that pretty much determines now that I know my kids and I'm like, okay, you seriously don't remember what we did yesterday. That's why you're having difficulty now instead of it being a defiant thing or being a time consuming thing or something like that. Like they simply do not remember. How can I help that? What strategies can we develop so that you remember at home what we did in class? Just a thought, and to take, of course, socioeconomic and ethnic factors into account, like students are not going to express what they remember in the same way, but perhaps we could find a measure for working memory and be able to learn that much about our students at the get-go, as well as like maybe set aside a group at the very beginning of the year and say, okay, we're going to go over some strategies for how we can remember what can we do in class. Maybe we can take pictures of anchor charts, maybe we can take pictures of the notes we're taking, Perhaps we can sit down and work through one of our problems on our own, right? When we get the homework, that way when we get home, we have a model or something. Find some strategy that'll help them develop that memory or have a strategy in place um, to bridge that gap. Also, strategies that can be carried out throughout their school career. A lot of times in the ADHD circles, we're talking about breaking up tasks into smaller pieces. I think that can be carried over into adulthood. We talk about having like short-term rewards along the way. Definitely something you can have in adulthood. Like when I was a undergrad college student, like every time we finished like 2 pages, eat a Skittle. Every time you finish 1 page, even eat a Skittle. A paragraph, eat a Skittle. Whatever you need to do. But helping students carry those over into their home lives and thus their adult lives. That would, of course, need to be specific to the student, what they need, what they struggle with, as well as how their percentages go for what they for where they fall on the ADHD spectrum. Lastly, that working memory requires training, and academic achievement requires working memory. If students cannot remember, then they cannot achieve academically. And it says nothing towards their intelligence, it says nothing towards their school history or their family. It simply is that if they do not have the strategies to remember, if those were either not developed early on or there's something neurological going on, that they will not be able to succeed. And it is not the student saying that I don't want to do this or I don't like this or defiance, but it's coming out in that way and saying, I don't have a strategy to do this, and they don't even know how to develop that strategy. And that being something that the teacher should help with. Here are my references, but it was an excellent read. I would suggest it to just about anyone. Yeah, there were a lot of excellent points about just like what classroom teachers can do in conjunction with school psychologists as far as developing working memory with students with ADHD, and that greatly improving their classroom achievement, as well as being able to keep them in the gen ed classrooms. Anyway, thank you. Hope you've had a great week. Have an awesome work week.